The meltdown over Restore Britain's success in Makerfield continues. I covered this both on my channel and on podcasts of the Lotus Eaters. This week, I'll be back more frequently. From now on, I missed you all. And I thought we'd just continue to explore the hit pieces that have been published, the interviews conducted, rubbishing Restore Britain for daring to represent the interests of the British people first and foremost before any other special agenda, community group, or foreign country. I thought we'd start with Jacob Rees-Mogg here. You know, remember, Jacob Rees-Mogg, former Conservative cabinet minister who has recently endorsed reform in the Makerfield by-election, saying the Conservatives should stand down and make a Tory and Reform pact. When he was asked, should that include Restore Britain, he said, no, because Restore Britain contains within it people who have some very undesirable views. It's a bad day to be Jack Hadfield, who was spreading the bullshit lie that Jacob Rees-Mogg and Rupert Lowe have some sort of secret Tory pact based on Rupert's cheeky remark that he agreed to conduct his GB News interview with Jacob Rees-Mogg if he didn't insult the Tories as wet Lib Dems, because he was saying that so he could then insult them as wet Lib Dems. But then a bunch of schizo posters online said, see, Rupert Lowe has decided to disclose that he has a pact to get the Tories elected again. Believe me, even Rupert Lowe doesn't have the power to reverse the Conservative Party's fortunes. As I have joked time and time again, it's better that they start selling off the furniture in the Carlton Club for firewood than expect to ever be elected into government again. But it's very telling here that at the same time that Jacob Rees-Mogg has denounced Restore for being too extreme, he has also endorsed Reform and said Reform should make a pact with the Tories after the election. It may be an electoral necessity. Basically, Reform the vehicle by which the Conservatives could get back into government. And it's not surprising, because if you look at Restore, I mean, they hired one ex-Tory MP who should be sacked, and Scott Benton should never have been hired. Believe me, I'm agreeing with you. Whereas if you look at Reform, they've got Nadine Dorries, Nadim Zahawi, about 20-odd others, including Robert Jenrick as their Shadow Chancellor and Suella Braverman, despite her attempt to try and do something when she was in the Home Office, as Shadow Education and Equality Secretary. So the idea that Reform are not the Tory Trojan horse? Laughable. Jacob then appeared on the Daily Tea and had a discussion with Camilla Tominey, who said that Rupert Lowe and Nigel Farage agree on basically everything. I mean, they don't. Restore Britain's going to ban legal migration from India, Pakistan, Nigeria, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, and the rest of the Third World. Reform UK will never go there, given they've populated their top party brass with Muslims like Zia Yusuf, who they want to put in charge of immigration. And the police, by the way, after he filed a false police report against Rupert Lowe, had his house raided, his shotguns confiscated, and they tried to put him in prison for promising to deport the perpetrators of the Pakistani rape gangs and the families that covered it up. And that's another thing they don't agree on. Nigel Farage said that was beyond the bounds of reasonableness, decency, and morality, and was the reason he knew he just had to get rid of Rupert Lowe in a brutal fashion. Apparently, deporting child gang rapists is beyond the pale for Nigel Farage. So I don't see how Camilla Tominey said that they agree on basically everything. But Jacob Rees-Mogg then said, simultaneously, Rupert Lowe is engaging in a vain, egotistical project with Restore Britain. They have no hope of winning. But also he needs to stand down for the good of Reform UK. So if he's insignificant, isn't worth worrying about, then why does he need to stand down? It's because you recognise he's a credible threat to both Reform and your preferred party of government, the Tories, getting back into government. He also then says there are far too many extremists in Restore to make common cause with. Bear in mind, as somebody pointed out beneath Rupert Lowe's post, Jacob Rees-Mogg gave the same response as Richard Tice to questions about demographics when Stephen Edgington interviewed him a few years
ago. Our demographic change going too far too quickly?
Oh, I'm not concerned about it at all. I'm not concerned about the racial makeup of the country. I am concerned about the borders issue and the number of people coming.
Okay, I'm concerned about the demographic makeup of the country, Jacob, because I've got 2 kids on the way, and unlike you, I can't just retreat to a manor house in a leafy area of Somerset where the diversity hasn't come yet. Watch Morgoth's latest video. He makes an excellent example. Even our sacred places where we thought they would be naturally dissuaded from coming to, like the countryside, beaches, the peaks and the lakes and the valleys, the diversity will come there anyway. There's just a relentless demographic march into our sacred spaces, and so they'll come for Somerset eventually. But Jacob Rees-Mogg thinks that he's rich enough and privileged enough to be detached from this problem. So demographic concern is not a concern of his. Well, it is for a large share of the British electorate. I think it's 45% that Migration Watch polled recently that said they don't want to become a demographic minority in their own country. We've seen how it works in South Africa. We've seen how religious minorities are treated in Lebanon. We don't want that fate for ourselves and our children. Thanks. And Rupert Lowe responded to Jacob Rees-Mogg saying, "You are prohibited from being part of this unification of the right, conservatism, reform, with fine with me." He's the only man willing to be outside the boundaries of the establishment. He's the only one willing to colour outside the lines that have constrained us and kept us on rails to our demographic, economic, and national obsolescence. And that's why, at the moment, he is inspiring so much confidence that he means what he says, he has the courage of his convictions, and he will keep his word. And so even if Reform and Restore were promising the same policies, they aren't. But even if they were, who do you trust to carry them out? It's not Nigel Farage and his merry band of minorities and Tories who don't want to get called racist and are too compromised by their actions in the previous government to be trustworthy to clean up the mess that they made. If we dig into the details of this story that Rupert's responded to, the Daily Mail says, the Conservatives initially appeared to enjoy a friendly relationship with Mr Lowe following his expulsion from Reform UK. Last October, the party handed him one of their allocated seats on the Public Accounts Committee, a senior Commons panel scrutinising government spending. That's because Rupert is a successful businessman. He's also a very keen small state economist. He's interested in efficiency and the slashing away of waste. And yes, he does speak about Margaret Thatcher as Mrs. Thatcher, because he's a man of a certain generation. He is perhaps a bit more misty-eyed about the 80s than those of us who weren't born in that period, and have only grown up in the civilization that Blair made, as the heir to Thatcher, and then Cameron as the heir to Blair. Nevertheless, what I think Rupert's actually saying when stripped of its ideological gloss is, I have the preferences and prejudices of your average Englishman. We should run small businesses, the state shouldn't be meddling with my life, and I should be allowed to just get on with it, tend to my farm, look after my garden, take care of my family, build a little business, and be a pillar of my community. And I think that's the sort of noble life that every hobbit can aspire to. It is also understood that the party held discussions following Mr Lowe's expulsion from Reform about allowing him to defect to the Conservative Party. Yes, they offered him the whip and he declined. And Rupert's actually played a blinder here, because he politely declined at the time, which then led them to giving him the seat on the Public Accounts Committee, because they thought it might entice him over, and then he took the seat and then set up Restore Britain anyway, after the rape gangs inquiry, where he found that both the Tories and Labour were implicated in not solving the problem. At least one MP warned Mrs Badenoch it would be him or me, such was their opposition to allowing the hard-right MP to cross the floor. Right, so the Conservatives would have defected en masse if Rupert Lowe were to join the Conservative Party. So the Conservatives don't agree with mass deportations, they don't agree with accountability for the rape gangs, they don't want to ban legal migration from India, Pakistan, Nigeria, they don't want to ban cousin marriage, they don't want to ban public Muslim prayer or halal and kosher slaughter, but there are an increasing number of Conservative MPs calling for a pact with Reform. So what does that tell you about Reform? Reform is more palatable to the Conservatives than Restore Britain. Restore Britain would have caused an apoplectic crash-out from the Parliamentary Conservative Party if Rupert Lowe was allowed to join the Conservatives. But Reform UK, making a pact, well, you've got all of their surrogates and media moguls like Paul Marshall saying, well, it may be an electoral necessity, we're going to migrate MPs like Danny Kruger and Sola Braverman and Robert Jenrick over to make the coalition easier to negotiate, not getting the same in Restore Britain. Rumours of a gentleman's agreement between the Tories and Lowe were further fueled when Restore failed to stand a candidate in the upcoming Aberdeen South by-election. That's because there isn't a Restore Britain branch there yet, and Restore Britain are only going to choose candidates from their local branches, because they're not going to parachute in candidates. So, in order to keep their promise, they decided not to stand someone there. This is why a spokesman for Restore Britain claimed they're not standing in Aberdeen South, unlike Makerfield, because as a new party, we're focusing our efforts on where we can win. Yes, they don't have a ground game in that area of Scotland yet. They've only just established the Glasgow branch with the SDP's Craig Houston defecting over. Welcome, Patriot. Otherwise, there isn't anyone to stand up there, so why would they waste their time parachuting someone into the constituency that doesn't know the area? Be dishonest to sort of carpet bag those living in Aberdeen South. Anyway, a senior Conservative Party source said, Kemi has been clear, no pacts, no stitch-ups. Kemi will win through her serious, thought-out plan to get Britain working again. They branded the allegations that Badenoch and Lowe have some sort of electoral pact as a silly conspiracy theory. Yeah, it's just not true. But the most interesting part of this is that, and this is Christian Calgie writing in the Mail, who's been writing relentless anti-Restore pieces over the last week. He's also been following Reform around on the campaign trail. I have liked Calgie's reporting in the past, but this just seems like shameless partisanship, and it's quite disappointing. Anyway, he says, and notice the framing, "It is understood that the Conservatives cannot withdraw Mr. Lowe from their allocated seat on the Public Accounts Committee, as it would require a bespoke motion in the House of Commons." Translation. A Conservative MP told me they're furious that Rupert Lowe played them like a fiddle, and now they can't remove him from the committee appointment they've put him on, that has raised his public profile and allowed him to grill civil servants and generated viral clips of him trying to seek accountability for the taxpayer. They can't remove him, not because he's doing a bad job, but because it no longer politically advantages them, but also it's too burdensome to go through the parliamentary process of removing him, even though they would like to. So, Calgie there is probably masking a Conservative Party source that is going, oh god, we've inadvertently allowed Rupert Lowe to increase his profile off the backs of us when we were actually hoping to steal his credibility and reanimate the corpse of the Conservative Party and allow it to shamble on back into government. Rupert's played a blinder, and they're seething about it. Other outlets have noticed. The Financial Times has finally written a hit piece on Restore Britain with the ominous Frankensteinian figure of Rupert Lowe looming large over Nigel Farage. And this piece is the typical recycled rhetoric about Restore Britain being a purely online phenomenon and too far right. But in here, it is admitted that Restore Britain present a credible threat to Reform UK because they're promising to do all the things that Reform once promised and were voted for in 2024 by many of its supporters. 1 in 8 2024 Reform voters is now voting Restore. They've got 135,000 plus members. It seems that they have momentum, and Reform know it. I've spoken to people in Reform recently who have been keen to downplay the threat played by Restore, but they wouldn't have reached out to me and spoken to me, I don't think, if they weren't keen to manage public perceptions about the inevitability of Reform sort of slipping away, and Restore Britain being an insurgent force on their rightward flank. And this piece says, now Restore is showing signs of breaking out from its digital realm and Lowe's own Norfolk stronghold. It is garnering enough interest to threaten Reform's chances against Andy Burnham in June's Makerfield by-election. Focus groups and anecdotal evidence suggest a surprising degree of support. It keeps coming up in focus groups, and whenever someone like Dan Hodges or the Times political podcast presenters go down to Makerfield and just look at the canvassing, they're seeing more Restore Britain supporters, more Restore Britain signs, posters, leaflets, and people just bringing it up in pubs or outside supermarkets. There is an organic presence of Restore Britain in the constituency that wasn't being picked up a week ago when they were polling, and they weren't prompting Restore Britain in every part of the poll. And that's why in this piece they admit, after decades of menacing the Tories from the right, Farage is facing his own threat from the fringe, and Lowe is using Farage's attention-seeking playbook to build traction. It would be funny if it weren't so troubling. I'm glad you're terrified, because remember, the Financial Times is the paper on whose behalf Boris Johnson carried out the Boris wave to make them like him again. So if we have the disapproval of the Financial Times, as Ash Sarkar once said, we're winning, lads. He says, it is still early days, not least in Makerfield, but Farage and his allies are visibly rattled, especially by the support from Musk. This is why there is a coordinated, concerted media pylon that looks transparently like a marshalling of the forces to defend a besieged Bailey. If Lowe keeps them scared, it could have wider consequences, not least by forcing Farage into a strategic choice he has worked hard to avoid. Restore's pitch is a more hardline offering, even one more hostile to immigrants in both rhetoric and detail. It draws enthusiasm from openly racist and anti-Semitic white nationalist groups, the kind who once flocked to the far-right British National Party. The British National Party were infiltrated by state intelligence agents. They had, again, a coordinated media pylon for them at the time. They suffered from a lack of prudent leadership, let's say. But were the British National Party at the time correct about things like the Pakistani rape gangs? Yes. And if the media hadn't have made more noise about the BNP and the far right than they did about the grooming gangs, then lots and lots of girls wouldn't have been raped, trafficked, tortured, drugged, sometimes killed. So, for all of the scaremongering about the British National Party then and now, The media has blood on their hands. And so to have their disapproval, again, it's an endorsement. All of their insults are endorsements. What's interesting here is the Financial Times admits that reform are containment. Farage argues that he is the safety valve that destroyed Britain's far right, but he also knew their supporters would probably vote for him anyway. Reform is not doing so well that it can afford to lose too many of them if they find a purer alternative home. A confident Farage would hang tough and bet on squeezing Lowe at a general election. He could treat it as an opportunity, using Restore as a decontamination chamber to make his own party look less extreme, proof that he remains within the admittedly shifting boundaries of political decency. Reform are containment even if they're not trying to be. That's what they're saying here. And they are containing your anger. They are rerouting your anger at the state of your own country into their agenda. The continuity of the politics that the establishment finds palatable and allows reform and former Conservative politicians to be invited to posh dinner parties, get awards from the Spectator, go to their summer garden party. Rupert's not interested in that. He cares about his family, his farm, his friends, his country, and all other insults are battered away with an I don't care. And I think we should adopt his posture. It says, even defeat in Makerfield can be used as a warning against splitting the right-wing vote, but he would have to hold his nerve. Opponents of Farage will welcome the prospect of his vote fracturing, of the revolutionary right eating itself. Lowe could be the best thing to happen to Labour since universal suffrage, but it comes with a cost. The boundaries of debate have already changed sharply. Anti-immigrant, particularly anti-Muslim sentiment is open and normalised. Oh, I wonder what made people anti-Muslim. Maybe it was the thousands of rapes, murders and terror attacks. Here and all across Europe and America. Maybe it was that. No, it's just media misinformation. It's just people saying things online about the terror attacks that Muslims are committing that has made people opposed to Islam. It's just people posting headlines of all of the brutal murders and assaults committed by fake asylum seekers and legal migrants alike that has made people against immigration. It's just reality itself. People walking out of their door and seeing their town, their high street, their neighbourhood demographically terraformed without ever having voted for it. He says, Reform and the Tories have moved significantly, both adopting deportation strategies. A buoyant Restore could shift them further. Much will depend on how frightened Farage feels, but the last thing an already polarised nation needs is a new bidding war on the anti-immigrant right. Actually, it's exactly what it needs. Because until very recently, no political party has represented the socially conservative disposition and nativist sentiment of the British people. The British people do not want to be dispossessed of their only nation. They don't want to have their children deprived of a predictable future, an inheritance. But every single Labour and Conservative politician for the last few decades are well to the left of the electorate on social views and national sovereignty. Things like death penalty. The only party that is proposing not just a national conversation or a spirited debate or an inquiry and investigation into those issues, but a full repeal of malign legislation and a restoration of our sovereignty is Restore Britain. And that's why people are going to it. And Rupert Lowe seems pretty content at this, actually. He says, Restore Britain has had hit pieces from almost every media outlet in the country over the last few days, but we were missing the Financial Times. Fear not! It's just been published. A full house. Complete your bingo card, ladies and gentlemen. We're broadening our horizons now, beyond the broadsheets and even some of the tabloids, though, to magazines and special interest outlets. And we go first to the Middle East Eye. Restore is explicitly nativist. The party spokesman, Charlie Downs, said in February, Reform UK believe that anyone from anywhere can become British. Restore Britain believes that Britain is a people defined by indigenous British ancestry and Christian faith. As I pointed out, people pay for this kind of good publicity, you know? I think Downs actually in the quote tweet said, in other news, water is explicitly wet. Patriot. This is why this guy's one of the best friends. And then on the other side, Rod Liddell, who once wrote that the criminalisation of CP is a bit of a moral panic. I wish I was joking, by the way. It was in 2003. It was in The Guardian. He wrote of laws criminalising CP. The one laudable and necessary aim to protect children from abuse has become warped by our consuming, obsessive hatred for those who find children sexually attractive. There is no causal link between viewing child and abusing children. And the Spectator think this is a good person to have as a recurring columnist. Weird that that hasn't come up yet. Anyway, the main point that Rod Liddell decides to complain about in here is there is a whiff of sulfur when Islam and immigration are mentioned, even if it is more implied than directly expressed. We will see when Lowe publishes his inquiry into Asian, Pakistani Muslim, rape gangs, how deep his antipathy is. Yeah, you're going to see that around the early part of June. Also, on Monday, at time of recording, it'll be Monday in the first week of June, there is going to be a parliamentary debate at 4:30 p.m. into the rape gangs that both Robbie Moore and Rupert Lowe will be taking part in. So I'm going to cover that. Weird, though, that Rod Liddell thinks that there is a whiff of sulphur about a politician calling for the accountability of family and clan Muslim rape gangs. But actually viewing child abuse material is not. Quite conspicuous. Another conspicuous pattern is with Brendan O'Neill. You remember Brendan, he wrote that dreadful article that read like an episode of The Boys last time, in Spiked, about Restore Britain, filled with expletives and cringe references to bodily functions. Now, Brendan O'Neill and his whopping great forehead has written a piece in The Spectator saying, Restore the Greens and the Rise of Gen Z Jew Hate. So this is just another piece complaining about the horseshoe theory of antisemitism. Bear in mind, the horseshoe theory complains about a consensus on both sides of the aisle, how they begin to mirror each other, but the whole point of the horseshoe is there's a middle point of the horseshoe, which means there is a consensus, which means there is a narrow parameter of regime-endorsed opinion, and Brendan O'Neill, again, has made a comfortable career colouring inside the lines of that regime-endorsed opinion, pretending to be a voice for the working man, meanwhile writing for Living Marxism, then Spiked, after Living Marxism had to change its name to Spiked, because they got hit with a libel lawsuit. Spiked, by the way, and Living Marxism were the mouthpieces of the Revolutionary Communist Party, a member of whom was Munira Mirza, who is married to Dougie Smith, the dark arts fixer of the Conservative Party, who used to run orgies in stately homes, and then mysteriously got put in charge of Conservative candidate selection under David Cameron. Weird that, I'm sure there's no connection there. Munira Mirza was the person who stormed out of Downing Street after Boris Johnson said Keir Starmer failed to prosecute Jimmy Savile as Director of Public Prosecutions. She's also a long-time family friend of Rishi Sunak, and she created the Race Equality Committee that meant that Kemi Badenoch could make her name on Tony Sewell's report. So, you know, she's been astroturfing various members of the Conservative Party along with her husband. She also went to work for Keir Starmer in Downing Street recently, and she, via her organisation Civic Future, has been passing candidates to Reform UK to start a civil service with. So that's this sort of noxious sphere of reportedly former Trotskyists that the likes of Brendan O'Neill, Munira Mirza, Inaya Falar in Oman, Baroness Claire Fox, and Frank Furedi orbit. And their number one issue is Israel. I don't know why. I genuinely don't know why. Brendan O'Neill is Irish, right? He's a bit like Morgan McSweeney. Morgan McSweeney was a protege of Peter Mandelson and went and trained on a kibbutz. I haven't seen anything from Brendan O'Neill about that sort of upbringing, but for some reason, Israel is his number one issue. He's written a book on October 7th, and don't get me wrong, absolutely appalling atrocity. But that's his issue. Israel is not our issue. I am quite indifferent about Israel. Visited, nice food, bad driving, pretty hospitable people, but not my country, not my culture, not my conflict. And I'm not going to dedicate all of my time and attention and political capital to ensure that Israel has demographic and national security, but that I don't afford it to my own people. And that's something that Brendan O'Neill is actually pretty perturbed about, actually. It's essentially Restore Britain demanding the same position of unquestionable demographic dominance and possession of our own territory, political system and culture that Jews enjoy in Israel, but for the British people here in Britain. And Brendan O'Neill has decided to write yet another piece saying why that's evil and anti-Semitic, and you're basically like the Nakba marchers, or the people that prayed outside Downing Street in the aftermath of October the 7th. I would deport all of those people. But if I did that, you would probably call that illiberal and racist, wouldn't you, Brendan? So I'm actually interested in solving the problem for everyone, but instead you're more interested in sitting there and making a lucrative career, complaining about the problem, and then nipping at the heels of anyone who actually wants to solve it. They say, at first glance, the youth wings of Restore Britain and the Green Party would appear to have little in common. The former are angry, undersexed video gamers who only take a break from playing Rome Total War to type deport under viral clips of black kids fighting. What, you don't think we should be deporting foreign criminals, Brendan? Weird thing to say. We should just be stuck with this problem forever. The working man should be taxed on his work to pay for the bed and board and prison cells and youth clubs for machete gangs, should they? No, I think we should all stick them on a flight and send them elsewhere where they can just go. They can go stab each other in another country for all I care, but, you know, our kids shouldn't get caught in the crossfire and my taxes shouldn't be paying for their social housing, their poorly disciplined schools, their benefits, and then their inevitable prison sentences. But also the idea that the young lads of Restore Britain are angry, undersexed video gamers. I mean, I play games with my wife on occasion to take a bit of downtime from the grueling slog of politics, but most of Restore Britain's leadership are actually married. And also, most of Restore Britain's branch members are just mums and dads with small businesses or 9-to-5s who feel fiscally squeezed, like they're demographically backed up against a wall, and that they're worried about raising their children as a hated minority in their own country. I'm pretty sure that that's a really normal thing to do. That's why so many kids have been taken around in buggies doing the canvassing for Makerfield. Again, I'm married, got 2 kids on the way, have a very modest little house in a suburb that's starting to feel that demographic pressure. I spend most of my time in my garden, actually, rather than on Twitter. So your insults just don't really map onto reality. And the problem with these projections is that the gap between what you're saying and what reality actually is, what people's immediate first impression is from just interacting with Restore Britain canvassers, the disparity there is wide enough that your narrative will fall in it. And all that will happen is you'll beclown yourselves while Restore Britain looks credible, and they'll keep going up while fewer people listen to you. And so he says, there's something that binds these tribes together, the Queers for Palestine and Restore Britain. A hyper-suspicion of the Jewish state, and in some cases the Jewish people. Again, this is Brendan O'Neill's only issue. I promise you, I don't really spend that much time thinking about it. Okay? It's not my primary issue. My primary issue is the demographic security of my people and my nation. For some reason, it's not Brendan O'Neill's issue. Brendan O'Neill's primary issue is Israel. He spends a lot of time writing about it. Okay? Fine. But then you don't get to complain when me, or the working man that you claim to be a champion of, don't vote the way you want and are actually more concerned about their own country than they are about a country in the Middle East. Restore Britain, the edgelord party, led by bitter ex-reformer Rupert Lowe. Yeah, I'd be pretty pissed off if they tried to throw me in prison on false charges too, wouldn't you, Brendan? I thought you were in favour of free speech and against cancel culture, but apparently when Reform called the police on Rupert Lowe, have his house raided and his shotguns confiscated, put him through lawfare, apparently that's not a problem. Restore Britain is in the news over some of the iffy views of those in its ranks. Campaigners have raised concerns about the anti-Semitic views of some of the party's high-profile supporters. No, translation, Lance Foreman and Lois Perry. Lance Foreman, businessman, Lois Perry, leader of Reform Friends of Israel, a literal foreign lobbying group within the Reform Party, headed up by an advisor to the Labour Prime Minister of Israel, decided to circulate fake rumours that Steve Laws was working for the party, and then lie to Rupert Lowe over DMs and coordinate this in order to try and pressure the party with bad press. So it was a completely underhanded tactic. If you think I'm exaggerating this, by the way, I mean, Lois Perry decided to post all the screenshots of Lars Foreman and herself going back and forth, saying, oh, Rupert's responding. Rupert trusts me. I might get better info from him at a later stage. Making an enemy of him right now may be a wasted opportunity. Right. So this is an underhanded, subversive tactic to try and manipulate Rupert Lowe and Restore Britain into either adopting your preferred position on Israel, so you want to make Israel Restore Britain's primary concern. It's Restore Britain, clue is in the name, or to try and sabotage the party with a moral extortion racket of charges of anti-Semitism using the moral power of the post-war narrative and the atrocities of the Holocaust to basically blackmail people into either supporting Reform UK, abandoning Restore Britain, or turning Restore Britain into another vessel for lobbying on behalf of the Israeli nation. Sorry, just not going to happen, I'm afraid, and it's really gross and underhanded. Anyway, Brendan O'Neill starts whinging about Steve Laws, and he says, personally, I'd pay good money to see this bag of bones try to deport the black fellas who attend my gym. It's like a weird racial cuckold fantasy, isn't it? Like, you're basically getting a hard-on for imagining Steve Laws being beaten up by black guys? It's a really weird thing to do, isn't it? I mean, Brendan O'Neill calling people unsexed and weird. This is what I mean by immediate perceptions disarming the arguments that you're making. Because people will look at Brendan O'Neill and the cliff face between his eyebrows and his hairline, ranting and raving about anti-Semitism and wanting to see black guys beat up Steve Laws, and they'll go, all right, mate, it's just a bit odd, actually. Why are you swearing so much? Why are you so angry about this? And they'll see Rupert Lowe saying, I want to ban cousin marriage, I want to ban Indian migration, I'm going to deport foreign criminals, I'm going to cut your tax. And they're like, Alright, yeah, I'll go with the farmer and the dad, actually. I'll go with these guys instead. But more to the point, Brendan writes, you would expect a party that wants to win the votes of decent Brits to distance itself from a bloke who spews such infantile anti-British rhetoric. Not Restore, though. True to their sick former slogan, which is "We don't care," they seem unbothered by Lawes' wet dreams of a whites-only blighty. A spokesman refused to say whether Lawes is a member, well, because you're not meant to give out GDPR data of individual members, are you? And besides, he said, we're not going to police our membership. Yeah, we're not in the business of disavowing the statements or behaviour of law-abiding members of the public. And also, you shouldn't be made to answer for something someone else has said. And this isn't the standard that other parties or politicians are being held to. Brendan O'Neill would roll his eyes if I said, well, you know, Leon Trotsky favoured revolutionary terror and basically indiscriminate murder. Are you in favour of that, Brendan? And if so, why are you justifying murder with your ideology, Brendan, working for living Marxism? He would scoff and roll his eyes and write another 1,000-word tract about how I'm some unlearned troglodyte, I'm sure. But you're held to your own standards, I'm afraid. So if you're not willing to do that, then Restore Britain shouldn't be made to answer for things that they didn't say either. He says, so if there are cranks on Restore's membership books, the party appears not to mind. Imagine asking working-class Brits for their votes while being so blasé about the possible presence in your ranks of lowlives who have nice words for the dictator working-class Brits died to defeat. Okay. Yeah, I'm not in the let's rehabilitate the reputation of Adolf Hitler camp, and I don't think many people are, actually. But I don't think that the constant reanimation of the spectre of Adolf Hitler, the use of the Nazis as a bogeyman, beating people with a stick to say, well, they did these atrocities and so you don't get to have a country in the present, I don't think that's going to have its intended effect. What I think it's going to do instead is, as time goes on and people get desensitized, as some things fall out of living memory, and this taboo becomes the final vestige of an old order that has visited atrocities upon us via mass migration, people are going to care a lot less about you using the scarecrow of Adolf Hitler to spook them away from national sovereignty. And so this isn't going to have its intended effect. It's actually going to backfire. I mean, you guys have been apoplectic about the popularity of Nick Fuentes over the last sort of 6 months, and his popularity hasn't waned despite his edgy jokes and statements. And if anything, your hysteria about the topic has only added to his popularity and has only made people go, well, fine, I can put up with his rudeness and his coarseness and his edgelord jokes as long as it pisses you off, because you seem to be standing in the way, actually, of me gaining the kind of economic prosperity, peace, demographic security, feeling like I belong in my own country again, that I desire, but you seem to say is off limits because you're not concerned about it, and actually you're more concerned about the fate of Israel instead. So I think it's going to backfire. Just a hint. Meanwhile, Restore spokesman has been accused of insinuating that Nigel Farage has been bought off by Jewish money. Okay, doesn't name Charlie Downs, and he says has been accused of insinuating. By who? Anyone credible? I noticed Alex Phillips quote retweeted that, and then Charlie Downs put the question to her, what, should we be subordinating Britain's national interest to any country? India, Pakistan, Israel, America, anyone? Or should we be charting our own course? Sure, with allies if we decide that we want to be friends with you. But also, if you've acted against our national interest, we'll consider you an enemy and act appropriately. So, when you put the onus on them to justify why we should have community and foreign lobbying groups within parties, then they can't justify it. But instead, Brendan O'Neill has here not named Charlie Downs, not named the accuser, Alex Phillips, who is undergoing an unfortunate crash out at the moment. And I think that's because there's a bit of a sting of the libel lawsuits from living Marxism still ringing in their ears. The Jews as a secret puppet masters of our politics. How original. Another Restore representative responded by saying the party won't be bowing to the confected outrage about antisemitism. I think that was Harrison. I said something similar. Yeah. It's just another word in a long line of racist, Islamophobic, anti-Semitic, misogynist, far-right, Nazi. It's so boring. It's so boring. Just every name is thrown at you to try and put stones in your shoe as you walk calmly onwards to regaining possession of your own country. And you just have to weather these insults because they've been overused. They're powerless. They are magic spells that are mere illusions these days. We don't go in for minoritarian moral fetishes, he said. What a damning reflection of Restore's bourgeois insulation from everyday Brits, that it cannot see how sickened people will be by the branding of anti-Semitism as a fetish, even as Jews are being knifed to death by Islamists. Yeah, I'm not keen on Jews getting killed by random Muslims. I want to deport the killers, actually, but you're seemingly not in favour of reversing mass migration. And it's remarkably ironic that he's playing this frame game, where he's saying that Restore Britain is unbothered by all of the spells and incantations of the anti-racist state, and that unbotheredness is somehow bourgeois, whereas being concerned about being called racist is actually working class. I think if you walk down to your local working man's club, Brendan, or you walk down to a Wetherspoons in Hull or Newcastle or Yorkshire on a Saturday night, and you ask their opinion of the boats, they don't want to stop the boats, they're having very open conversations about sinking them. And if you call them racist, they'll go beyond I don't care. And that's because people feel desperate. And they just see, on a very superficial level, people that weren't here a few years ago, here now, that are obviously being paid by the government, using their taxes, to be in this country, committing crimes and turning their neighbourhood into somewhere that feels unsafe and unrecognisable. And so you're not a voice of the working class. You're actually parasitizing, like a proper Marxist, the feeling of dispossession, of alienation of the working native majority of this country, and then using it for your own nefarious ends. You're taking their anger and rerouting it to your agenda. You are engaging in containment, and you're trying to bring the nativist sentiment that is organic and latent within the British population that Restore Britain is speaking to, and put it firmly back on the liberal and Zionist plantation. And I'm sorry, it's not persuasive anymore. This is pulling what little remains of Brendan O'Neill's hair out over a containment breach. He's saying anyone who's encountered the middle-class youths who swell the ranks of both Restore and the Greens' digital fandom would have been struck by the moral parallels. The majority of Restore Britain's young supporters are not middle class, actually. They're the sons of working class people who have done a little bit better than their parents, but have still struggled, especially in the political arena, because the likes of your friend and colleague Claire Fox has said that older people need to gatekeep young people out of the institutions on the grounds that they're insufficiently liberal and progressive. So, actually, this doesn't resonate. And then he says, the British elites, the servants of Zionists, both say. It's time to cut ties with Israel, both cry. Jews should stop whinging, both whinge. The internet has dragged them headfirst into the most low IQ loathing, into that abyss of self-pity where the Jews come to be seen as a source of our every earthly and personal ill. Your country's broken, your borders are withered, you can't get a job, you've never had sex, you're bald, must be those Jews. I don't think anyone is actually blaming them for that. I think they're saying we don't want to abide by a double standard that says that Israel gets to enjoy a privileged position in our national politics, and a standard of self-conscious ethnic and religious identity, national security, and loyalty from our politicians, that we don't enjoy ourselves as the British people here in Britain. And you can't sustain that double standard. And you certainly don't make it any more powerful with these insults that are just petulant, childish, and don't map onto reality. Can't get a job, never had sex. Okay, can't get a job. I mean, bear in mind, 27 non-EU migrants have been hired for every one British young person in the last few years. So can't get a job, that's the fault of mass migration policy. And I have heard, by the way, from people that used to work at Spiked, that the employees of Spiked have said they don't actually care about immigration, they're for open borders. So your politics actually lead to this kind of state of affairs. But also, you're bold. Everyone in Restore Britain, bar the dashing Bo Dade, has a full head of hair. And really, Brendan, we're going to throw stones in glass houses, are we, about being bald? I probably wouldn't go for that attack line if I were you. Anyway, he ends it with, the question is, what are we going to do about it? Nothing. You're going to sit there and piss your pants in fear. That's what you're going to do. Because you keep trying to use these ritualistic denunciation tactics. You have gone to the sort of, the final and most powerful one of the post-war consensus, which is anti-Semitism. And you are overusing that, and I think you're jumping up and down like Rumpelstiltskin because it hasn't worked. They're not the only place to try this, by the way. The Daily Mail, again, Christian Calgie, very disappointing, has decided to do a piece profiling a member from Dundee who decided to be a prat 10 years ago and pose with... I'm not even sure what that symbol is, to be honest. This is how little I spend online in rather noxious subcultures. I'm pretty normie as it goes. And a skull mask throwing Romans. I mean, this guy admits this is cringe. I think this is just the result of someone not having people that care about him around him saying, I don't think this is the most prudent thing to do, mate. And ever since, he's actually just said, the picture was taken about 10 years ago, it was a different time, there were no legitimate avenues for young men in nationalism, so back then you thought you had to get dirty. Right, so he acted imprudently, didn't break the law, did something stupid a decade ago, and then Hope Not Hate wrote a hit piece on him, and someone in the local branch said, oh, well, we can't have that. And then Maria from Restore Britain, working for the leadership team, total patriot, lovely woman, got in touch and said, actually, local branch members don't have the ability to strip you of your membership and kick you out. You have to appeal to the Restore senior leadership team on the grounds that you've been, doing something illegal or compromising the data of another member of the branch or, something like that, or bringing the party into disrepute because you conflict with its core policy aims, not because 10 years ago you decided to do something daft and you've changed since. And he was reinstated. And now he's just going on litter picking. I mean, he looks like he's made himself a lot better. He seems a lot happier with himself. He's doing constructive things in his community. Good on you, lad. Maybe don't throw any more Romans, James, Just be a bit sensible. Then Calgi decided, again, to try and use Steve Laws against the party. Steve Laws isn't employed by Restore Britain. And they also went after Lewis for appearing on David Curtin's former show on TNT Radio. Sorry, but who cares? And they tried to also complain that Harrison had interviewed Martin Sellner and Renaud Camus. The Mail asked both Lewis Brackpool and Harrison Pitt whether they believe voters would be alarmed to see them sharing platforms with such individuals. Last night, the Jewish Leadership Council issued a damning warning about Restore Britain, branding their rise deeply worrying. I might like to point out that if you don't want to give life to a conspiracy theory about Jewish people having a disproportionate impact on British politics, you might not want to keep writing hit pieces accusing Restore Britain of anti-Semitism and then asking influential Jewish lobbying groups and groups working on behalf of Israel, the foreign country, to condemn them, to put pressure on the party to either ostracize their own members, sack their own staff, or pack up shop and just pull out of electoral politics. You might not want to keep using the charge of anti-Semitism to try to control British politics if you don't want the conspiracy theory to gain traction. Just a polite suggestion. And then the lads at Restore Britain had a response. They said, the newspaper's investigation is a desperate attack. We're not engaging in these increasingly desperate attacks by an establishment media that is clearly terrified of Restore Britain's rapid growth. If the Daily Mail wants to discuss our policies, we're more than happy to have that debate. Multiple attack pieces have now been launched by this paper, and judging by the comment sections on many of those articles, Daily Mail readers are seeing through it. We're not aiming to merely reform the UK, we are going to restore Britain, and the establishment absolutely despises us for that. If readers want radical change, and we mean radical, then back Restore Britain. The hysterical response to our own growth shows exactly why we are the only choice. And if you look at the comments and rank them by top rated, they're right. Anyone who thinks Restore is hard right is colouring their column with their own left-wing agenda. Wanting England returned to the English and to restore law and order is just a vote for common sense. The smearing of Restore begins. Ah yes, Hope Not Hate, the Soros-backed extreme left organisation that allows people that have interfered with young children to work within its ranks and has provided the vetting service to reform. Unlike Labour and to a lesser degree Reform, Restore have zero policies in a way directed at the Semitic population of the UK, other than banning non-stun slaughter. So unless they plan to do a Labour, they have nothing to apologise for or comment on, and these have thousands of upvotes. The attacks aren't working. All they're doing is serving to increase the profile of Restore Britain as an authentic alternative to the establishment parties on offer that the Daily Mail publishes articles from. Nigel Farage, Nadine Dorries, Boris Johnson, architect of the Boris wave. If the Daily Mail is against us, then, again, that's an endorsement. And when the Mail, after publishing another piece from Stephen Pollard, the former research director of the Fabian Society, who now lives in Israel, tried to use Steve Laws against the party, a party spokesman said, we're not going to police our membership. What Steve Laws says is up to Steve Laws. It has absolutely nothing to do with us. We've been very clear. We're not going to police our membership. The membership endorses our position, not the reverse. Obviously. And then they said, commenting that Charlie Downes had said MPs should serve their constituents in Britain's national interest, not foreign lobbies and minority advocacy groups, Restore Britain's official spokesman said their official saying, he's absolutely right. Restore Britain will put the British interests first each and every time. Fantastic. You don't need to disavow your own supporters. You don't need to play these disingenuous media frame games. You don't need to have foreign lobby groups in your party, like Labour Friends of Pakistan, Conservative Friends of India, Reform Friends of Israel. Instead, you can just represent your people, their interests, their preferences and prejudices, first, foremost, and exclusively. But the anti-Semitism line wasn't dropped. The Jewish Chronicle decided to complain about speech that Rupert Lowe gave in Makerfield. They decided to complain that he compared the Pakistani rape gangs to the Holocaust. Yes, it's basically a war crime. It is an ethnic and religious motivated crime of one group against the other, with torture comparable to the stories of Mengele's experiments. Thousands of girls abused, drugged, trafficked, some killed. Poor Charlene Downs minced into kebab meat, her body never to be found. Her killers, allegedly, got off scot-free because the police incompetently handled the investigation. But Jewish Chronicle seemed to think that the Holocaust occupies a privileged position, that the Holocaust is different from all other atrocities. I don't. I think denying any well-documented atrocity is a grave moral stain on your character. It shows that you're incapable of learning from the mistakes of history. I don't think innocent people should be butchered. But for some reason, the Jewish Chronicle thinks that the Holocaust is separated out from other atrocities, and that denying the Holocaust is worse, somehow, than denying other atrocities. And all I can think here is this is just ethnic partisanship. And if you're engaging in ethnic partisanship, then suddenly my sympathy for your plight diminishes, because you're not going to return the favour. And if the response to this video, by the way, is by Jewish people watching this video, I have some in my audience, and I hope you will. If the response is, well, you don't understand, Jews are under attack around the world, they are being attacked in Britain, in Golders Green, in Manchester, Jews are a global minority, Israel is surrounded on all sides by its enemies, and you're showing insufficient sympathy and solidarity, I would say, right, okay, if you feel like that, can you understand why we might feel like that? When the Muslims are killing us too. When the rape gangs are targeting our girls, just like Jews were targeted on October the 7th. When we are a global minority, and we're about to become a minority in our own country, something Israel would never allow to happen to Jews in Israel. Can you understand why we might be wanting to assert our claim to our country as the prerequisite for getting rid of the problems that are killing you guys as well as us? And if not, then you as individuals, your political position that says the British people do not deserve an exclusive claim to the possession of Britain, that politics is part of the problem rather than the solution. So the Jewish Chronicle wrote up that speaking at the launch of Restore Britain's campaign in Makerfield, Lowe claimed that the Labour government's response to revelations regarding group-based child sexual abuse in the UK amounts to denial of something the equivalent of the Holocaust. Pledging to release the findings of the unofficial rape gang inquiry, backed by the party, he said, I don't think anybody in this country can ever vote Labour again when they see that in that report that Labour has put its own power and its own ambitions ahead of the interests of the most vulnerable white working class girls who have been abused, and it's still going on as we sit here tonight and they've denied it. So they have denied something that is the equivalent of the Holocaust. These remarks were condemned by political figures and Jewish leaders. Why? I think these atrocities are comparable. Because lives have been ruined. Don't you? Why is one atrocity any worse than the other? What is it about the victims that don't warrant your sympathy? What is it about the atrocity itself that means that those denying it are not nearly as bad as those who deny the Holocaust? What is it? A spokesperson for the Jewish Leadership Council, them again, said the genocide of 6 million Jewish men, women and children by the Nazi regime and its collaborators was unique in both its systematic nature and industrial scale. Well, I mean, the Holodomor and Mao's Great Leap Forward, the Great Famine and the Cultural Revolution claimed a significant number of bodies too, so did the Khmer Rouge. I don't think it's unique. It's horrible, it's evil, but it's not unique. It's very strange. Drawing comparisons between the Holocaust and contemporary tragedies, however terrible, is not only inaccurate, but deeply offensive to survivors and the wider Jewish community. Why? David Taylor, the Labour MP for Hemel Hempstead, urged Lowe to apologise for the appalling comments. Yeah, didn't you vote against the grooming gang inquiry, mate? Not gonna listen to that. The problem with this narrative is that it demands that the atrocities of the Holocaust are the pole around which all of our politics revolves. And that means that the locus of moral concern is outside the British people themselves. In fact, it treats any indigenous, white, European, or Anglosphere population with suspicion, because at any time, for any unknown reason, they could just launch another genocide against the Jews. And so they have to be deprived of possession of their own country via checks and balances, via a liberal culture, as a safeguard against such atrocities ever happening. And I'm sorry, that happened in a particular time and place, based on a particular ideology, which isn't very common in Britain. And so I'm not willing to deprive myself and my children of the primary claim to my country because of paranoia that suddenly we're all going to start goose-stepping and setting up gas chambers. It's just not going to happen. It's just not true. And I responded to this, saying, I would say the racial and religious motivated rape, drugging, trafficking, torture, enslavement, and even murder of untold thousands of English children is an atrocity on the scale of 20th century war crimes, wouldn't you? And if not, why not? And Lance Foreman, the man who fabricated the rumour that Steve Laws was working for Restore Britain, which led to this piece in Jewish News, Toxic Antisemitism Surfaces as Restore Britain Eyes Decisive Role in By-Election, based on Steve Laws' interview with Andrew Gold from December. And then Lance Foreman had a phone call with Rupert Lowe and admitted that he mixed up Scott Benton, the former Tory MP who has Hebrew tattoos, who is an arch-Zionist. I mean, so is Steve Laws, because, you know, you need in Israel if he wants to deport Andrew Gold back there. That's a joke, by the way. Don't start crashing out on me in my mentions. He somehow confused Scott Benton with Steve Laws, decided to launch a pressure campaign, feeding the rumour through Lois Perry, again is Nigel Farage's mistress, and runs Reform Friends of Israel. Restore's never going to have Friends of Israel, by the way. You can count on that. We're never going to have any religious or foreign lobbying group in our party. Lance Foreman then said he confirmed over the phone, Rupert did, that it was an error, and in fact Steve Laws has no administrative function. He also said he found Steve Laws' comments about Jews grossly offensive. I agree naturally. Apparently this was overstated. Rupert just said, I don't agree with Steve Laws' position on just deporting every Jew to Israel. Yeah, okay, fine. Did anyone think that he did? Steve Laws doesn't think that. So this entire thing is just, again, a moral extortion racket, ran by a man, by the way, who is voting for reform, who has friends in reform. And he says, if I lived in Makerfield, would I vote for Labour or Liberal Democrat? Definitely not. Conservative, I'm a huge Kenny fan, but the vote would be wasted. Reform, I don't agree with some of their economic policies, but this isn't the general election, so the vote has to go to Reform to keep Burnham out. Right, so you're a Reform partisan who is engaging in deceptive machinations behind the scenes to try and damage Restore Britain's standing, trying to manipulate Rupert Lowe and gain his trust to drive a wedge between him and who you perceive are Restore's base, and you're promoting voting reform, and you're good friends with the head of Reform Friends of Israel, but then you're responding to me saying the grooming gang scandal and cover-up is a national disgrace. However, the assault of some 5,000 to 10,000 young girls is obviously on a totally different scale to the systematic murder of 6 million. Even a 3-year-old could work that out. Okay, so you go straight to insults. No reason, by the way. Never been unpleasant to you, mate. Also, 5,000 to 10,000. You are vastly underestimating the number of girls abused by this. Also the number of families of the girls who've been affected by it. The Sarah Champion's figure was in the hundreds of thousands. And that was in 2017. And she was the MP for Rotherham. So, you know, she'd probably know. So, the scale of the crime has never been uncovered. And yet, you're willing to downplay the number of victims and say that we can't compare the denial of the atrocities as being a comparable moral crime, rather than tallying up the atrocities themselves. Because if you notice, Rupert never actually tallied up the atrocities. He just said, denying the rape gangs is like denying the Holocaust, because you're denying the atrocity. And I said, well, what about this do you not agree with, and why do you go straight to insults? And he responded, according to the quote, he said it was the denial of something equivalent to the Holocaust. Yeah, an atrocity. Clearly, the grooming gang scandal is atrocious and evil, but it is not equivalent to the Holocaust. I think it is, actually. And I think, given, you know, October the 7th was repeatedly called the worst attack on Jews since the Holocaust, the grooming gang scandal is the equivalent of the Holocaust for British people, right? The Holocaust is the worst atrocity ever to happen to Jewish people. of course. The grooming gang scandal is ongoing and is the worst atrocity ever to happen to British people. And if you want me to have sympathy for Jewish people for the Holocaust on October the 7th, of course. But if you want me to have that sympathy and extend sympathy beyond my ethnic in-group, then you need to understand why I would also have sympathy for crimes committed against my ethnic in-group by an ethnic out-group, just like happened to yours. One person who doesn't have sympathy is a writer for the Jewish Chronicle, a woman named Jane Princely, who wrote, and this is unbelievable, the same party leader who's obsessed with banning kosher slaughter and was filmed making an anti-Semitic joke is now harping on about the grooming gang scandal being equivalent to the Holocaust. He's harping on about the grooming gang scandal. Harping on! Oh, it's really boring. As I said, so sorry industrial-scale child rape and torture is such a boring topic for you, Jane. What is it about the victims that don't warrant your sympathy? Perhaps it's because they're not Jewish, because she wrote a couple of days ago about an exhibition that she viewed about the October the 7th massacre, where, of course, people were butchered, tortured, raped, their bodies paraded through the street, taken hostage, treated as slaves. All the things that have happened, on a larger scale, by the way, if we're just, comparing raw numbers here, as Lance was saying we should. I'm not, but as Lance was saying we should. It's happened on a broader scale to the girls of Britain than it has to the victims of the October 7th massacre. And again, I visited the site. It's very moving to see all the testimonies of people who never returned to their loved ones. It's absolutely tragic. So why don't you care about the grooming gangs? Why is it only the victims of October the 7th that suffered comparable atrocities that warrant your sympathy? Why is someone trying to seek accountability for the perpetrators who fit a very similar profile to those of Hamas, Hezbollah? Why is it that those victims don't matter, those perpetrators don't deserve to be brought to justice, but those that did October 7th do? Rupert Lowe responded to the Jewish Chronicle piece saying, I want to be really clear in my response. I'm not going to retract anything. I stand by every single word. Labour are calling for me to apologise. The answer is no. Industrial rape across almost every town and city in Britain, sexual torture, murder. I sat there for 2 weeks listening to these girls, heard how one girl was brutalised by a dog, and Muslim men bet on what the animal would do. Girls were drugged and locked in cages like rats. Another, brutalised by over 700 men in 3 years. Dozens and dozens of stories throughout the inquiry, and we're barely scratching the surface. And he says, this was allowed to happen exactly because politicians were cowards refusing to discuss it. Because of the anti-racist taboo, instantiated after the Second World War, that treated the perpetrators as the real victims. I will not make that mistake. The Labour Party have blood on their hands, yet they think they can demand an apology from me for highlighting the systemic evil they allowed to infect our entire country. They can piss off. I'm angry about it, furious. When you hear directly from these girls about what they've been through, it changes the way you see politics forever. The report will be out soon. When that happens, I don't want any apologies from the Labour Party. I don't care. I want to see those politicians responsible for covering up this atrocity behind bars for what they've done to these girls. That includes the likes of Dennis McShane, who admitted he knew about it and did nothing because as a Guardian-reading liberal lefty, I didn't want to rock the multicultural boat. Or, David Blunkett, the former Home Secretary, or who Andy Burnham was working for, by the way, who tried to repeatedly criminalise causing offence to religious communities while the grooming gangs were operating in his Sheffield constituency. And the hit pieces just keep coming about this particular topic because Lee Harpin, who, if you don't know, is an author for Jewish News, said, spoke to Labour source earlier, like me, disgusted Restore has been given a path into mainstream politics by the Makerfield by-election. Every other door, he said of his stint up there yesterday. They're petrified of the success of Restore Britain. So what are they trying to do? Well, that particular author wrote the previous hit piece in Jewish News on Restore Britain about Steve Laws based on Lance Foreman's rumours. And he also apparently wrote a piece on me in February that nobody noticed. So we're going to have a look. Let's have a good laugh, shall we? Apparently, Nigel Farage is facing mounting criticism from right-wing nationalists in the UK over his decision to allow separate Jewish and pro-Israel organisations to operate within the party. Leading nationalist commentators, including reactionary populist Connor Tomlinson, I'm offended you use the term populist, I'm very unpopular, don't you know, have responded to the launch of the Reform Jewish Alliance and Reform Friends of Israel groups by accusing Farage of selective nationalism and of prioritising the interests of a foreign lobby over those of the English people at a time of crisis. Yes, absolutely true, I stand by my words. He doesn't think the English people exist, he thinks it's about how you feel, what your priorities are. He said a Welsh person is someone who's lived and settled in Wales for 5 to 10 years, meaning Axel Rudikamana is a Welsh choir boy, according to Nigel Farage. And he says that the Jews should survive as a race, but he isn't bothered about demographic change in Britain. Yeah, so he is a selective nationalist. He doesn't care about Britain. Tomlinson, who is closely linked to MP Rupert Lowe's newly launched political party Restore Britain, which has called for a ban on both kosher and halal slaughter, yep, I wrote the paper, has built up a significant following on Spotify and YouTube espousing his staunchly anti-Islam nationalist stance. Weird how Jewish news isn't against Islam, despite them being the ones perpetrating terror attacks against Jews. Like, sorry that I actually want to solve the problem that's getting Jewish people killed, rather than just hand-wring about bigotry that then keeps people in the country that shoot at synagogues and stab Jews in Golders Green. Yeah, sorry, I actually want to get rid of those people because they don't belong here, they weren't wanted, they're a threat to Jews and whites alike, and even if they practice their religion peacefully, it's not going to replicate my culture. But for some reason, my stance on that issue has pissed you off so much you've decided to write a massive hit piece on me. And obviously, mentioning there my significant following on Spotify and YouTube, please subscribe, hit the notification bell, read myself on Substack. I am on Spotify as well if you want to listen to me on the go. Obviously, that is intended to try and provoke the companies to demonetize me, take away my livelihood. So again, it's an extortion racket. And you wonder why people are sick to death of this kind of politics. An increasingly bitter row with conservative Jewish peer Lord Downing-Finkelstein, Tomlinson, a practicing Catholic, has faced allegations of anti-Semitic thinking. That's the most Orwellian phrase possible, isn't it? We need to check your thinking. After accusing the newspaper commentator of double standards on Israel. Yes, in the immediate aftermath of the Bondi Beach massacre, he said he didn't feel safe in London anymore. But then, when I said, okay, the Muslims committing the terror attack should go home, Danny, and that British people should enjoy the same national identity and sovereignty that Jews do in Israel, don't you agree? He said no. He said that I was a racist. So, actually, yeah, he does have a double stand on Israel. He's an ardent Israeli nationalist, despite occupying a position of privilege in the House of Lords in Britain, but wants to deprive the British people of their primary say in their own country. Harpin writes, the dispute is emblematic of a wider argument now gaining traction on the nationalist right, which accuses influential Jewish figures such as Finkelstein of defending Israel as a vital ally and bulwark against anti-Semitism, while failing to support English nationalists when they seek to rid the country of the jihadist threat. I don't think that's what I said, but that is true. Yeah, you are acting as the final gatekeeper against us regaining possession of our own country, and as it happens, keeping you safe from Muslim terrorists. So I'm not going to join you in this civilizational suicide pact, actually, and I know a bunch of Jews that agree with me as well. They may not be so vocal about it because they'll be cancelled by their own community, but I've had them reach out. Some have joked that they'd happily go vegetarian so long as we can ban halal and engage in a push factor for all the Muslims trying to kill them. So Jewish news don't actually represent the overwhelming body of Jewish opinion, though if you did want to stop the accusation that Jewish people have an outsized influence on British politics, maybe a full-spectrum attack against Restore Britain on the grounds that they're anti-Semitic by lots of media commentators in various outlets like the Spectator and the Daily Mail and Jewish News and Jewish Chronicle and Reform Friends of Israel. Maybe that was the wrong strategy. So they read my essay after going to Israel. They say, last year, Tomlinson visited Israel as a guest at the Herzl Institute and its chairman, Yoram Hazony. The Herzl Institute is a key sponsor of the National Conservative Movement, which Hazony leads and with which Tomlinson has previously aligned. I've been to the conference. But on his return, Tomlinson published an article titled Why Israel Lost the Right, and voiced further criticism in a series of media interviews. Do you know that people were trying to translate that into Hebrew, by the way, and publish it in the Israeli press because they thought that it was actually an accurate analysis of why Israel has lost so much support in our respective countries? It turns out that there are some people that actually just like hearing the truth for a change. I said, the modern Western right is becoming disillusioned with unconditional support for Israel, and said that younger reactionary conservatives increasingly view Israel as a foreign lobby that prioritises its own security at the expense of Western national interests. Yeah, I'm describing the perception that lots of people have. Do you think you're helping this perception with this hit piece? Do you think any of you are helping the perception that anti-Semitism is just used now as a term to prescribe a certain way of doing politics, which actually a vast majority of the British public agree with? Because I don't think you are. I think you're doing great harm to your own cause, but hey, don't let me stop you. But this is the actual reason why all these hit pieces were published. Politico published one, which was actually quite fair. Nigel Farage is facing his own threat from the right in Makerfield. If you scroll down, they admit that their gatekeeping techniques are less powerful than they used to be. They mentioned that Asmongold has featured clips of Lowe on his channel. He's also highlighted ones from Charlie Downs and Lander. It's weird that my mutuals are getting broadcast to millions. The supportive videos have amassed close to 5 million views on YouTube, and that number would be significantly higher if live streams and clips posted by other content creators were taken into account. Yeah, the Lotus Eaters, myself, Lander, Green and Pleasant, Andy the Gabby Cabby, whoever else has expressed support for Restore Britain, the views are in the millions every month now. And this is organic. That's why they're afraid. It's because we don't need funding from Paul Marshall. We don't need write-ups favourable in Politico, The Guardian, The Daily Mail, The Telegraph, The Spectator, Jewish News. We don't need all that stuff. Instead, people are flocking to us because we're saying things that resonate. We're not trying to persuade you that things aren't as they actually appear. I think we've got a good track record of calling out problems, suggesting solutions which establish credibility. And that's what the election is being fought on. Who do you trust to deliver their policy promises? And I don't agree with the premise that these policy prospectuses are converging, but let's say they are. Well, that means that the election itself is even more of a character judgment. Because if everyone's offering the same policy, then you choose based on the credibility and trustworthiness of the salesman rather than the product itself. And to many people, Rupert Lowe is looking like the most trustworthy. And I'm getting vibes from 2016 here, where, a bit like Hillary Clinton, Reform UK have declared themselves to be Madam President, that it's their turn, that Nigel deserves it, and they're outspending Rupert Lowe in this election. Labour and Reform have spent thousands on slick Facebook and Instagram ads. Restore have only spent 6,000, but Rupert has a Facebook following of 1.2 million, twice the number of Keir Starmer's, and the figures they're pulling in across YouTube, Facebook, X, are dwarfing Reform UK's reach. Farage comes within a whisker of getting ratioed on pretty much every post now. The aura of momentum is now with Restore Britain, and that has prompted this coordinated pylon from all of the surrogates in the media that support either an establishment branch of doing politics or reform explicitly, and all it's done is create the impression that Rupert Lowe is the only man that can't be bought or controlled, that he is the underdog facing down an establishment that is complicit in crimes such as the grooming gangs and has been for decades, and will do nothing about them, that will call the police on him when he promises to deport the perpetrators. And if you wanted proof that this is coordinated, there's an interesting piece of information here from John Rentoul, who writes for The Independent. I think he's Blair's biographer. He alleges that last year, when Rupert Lowe gave an interview to Andrew Pearce and said, yeah, Nigel Farage is the Messiah, but we need a credible policy offering, we need a shadow cabinet, we need to show the electorate that we're ready to govern, which is one of the real reasons he was kicked out of Reform. It wasn't the fake bullying allegations or the threat to Zia Yusuf that was reported 3 months after it didn't happen. Rentoul writes, no wonder Farage is so touchy. He has always reacted to Lowe with a vehemence that I thought was out of proportion and counterproductive, right from the original falling out that led to Lowe's expulsion. I'm told that Farage and his aides marched into the Daily Mail offices a year ago to complain about the interview with the newspaper in which Lowe said Farage was unfit to be Prime Minister. Lowe didn't even say that. But the fact that that was their impression, and that Reform showed up at the Daily Mail and demanded that that outlet bend the knee to them, parrot their party line, shows you that they have their tendrils in all of the outlets that are now publishing hit pieces against Rupert Lowe. Rupert Lowe is a threat to the Conservatives getting back into power by the Reform backdoor, or by an explicit pact between Badenoch and Reform. He's a threat to the Ming vase being carried into Downing Street that has Paul Marshall and Peter Thiel and Nigel Farage's hands on it. Rupert Lowe is a threat to the establishment's containment exercises, and that's why they're freaking out and calling us every name under the sun. Why Jewish News is wasting its time watching my videos. Hello again. Writing full-length hit pieces about me. Just now a dad, yapping about politics from his study. They're afraid. Because the most threatening thing to their delicately crafted political consensus is the truth. And I'm sorry, I'm just never going to vote for a group of liars no matter how much you try to persuade me.